Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this historic and slightly different way to present the rest of the material for this history class. Um, in case you're in the wrong place, this is Art Design History 1. There are 3 lectures left, 3 weeks of lectures left. This is the first of those 3, and this lecture and probably the other 3 will be divided into parts. This one will be divided into 2 parts, a part A and a part B. This is the beginning of part A. Before I get going with the content, a couple of things sort of that I would normally do, I guess kind of housekeeping stuff. Um, there was an assignment due this week. That is today. Well, what is now yesterday? 25th of March, there was an assignment due. According to our sheet, there will be one other 5% assignment. I'm going to cancel that. Okay, so the only thing left to do assignment-wise is the final project. I'm going to put up a PDF in the next day or so with the final complete information about that. You should have a fairly clear sense of what that means in general terms. What I will now produce is a sheet with the specifics of what I still expect, what we still expect for this part of this assignment, for this part of the course. It basically should go without saying that we're going to be very generous with what we will accept and what we're expecting with this assignment. Um, Obviously, times are peculiar and getting more and more peculiar by the day. Uh, I don't know about you, it feels even a little bit weird to me to be continuing with the content, but at the same time, it feels exactly right. And as I sort of seem to try to suggest in my message in my PDF, um, the whole point of this course has been to show that human beings continue no matter what and produce some amazing things no matter what throughout history, from a 750,000-year-old hand axe to our present moment. We will face challenges and we make interesting things along the way. This course has just been a way to try to situate yourselves and our course in general, our program rather in general, in that context. So, that having been said, the only thing you have remaining, assuming you have done all the assignments that have been due up to this point, is the final piece, the material concept project. Obviously, you are not making an object anymore, but what we will be asking for is submissions that get as close to that as possible. Sketches, drawings, more than one sketch though. This isn't just something you do on the back of an envelope or a cocktail napkin and take a photograph of it and submit it. It has to be a sketch as if you were going to try to make this in some way or another. Now, of course, this means we have an extra degree of flexibility. You can suggest that you're going to make your object out of bronze and marble now, if you like. How exactly you would realize that will be difficult if you're not very familiar with bronze casting and marble carving. So I would suggest that you still try to keep it within the parameters of what you might actually be able to achieve. But having said that, we're looking for you to answer the question more importantly than worry about those kinds of details. Again, I'll put this all in a document and I'll post that in the next few days. Okay? Right, time to move on to some content. As I say, this is part A, and I'll post the part B video as a separate part, but it'll be a continuation of this video. We're calling this week's lecture In the Wake of the Industrial Revolution because although we are still in that wake, it's the beginning of the wake that we're now following. And basically I'm following directly on from Gord's lecture 2 weeks ago, the last time we were all together in class. There's a lot in between, I think a lot that Gord left unsaid between these 2 lectures, and I think Gord is hoping to create some material at some point to fill that in. Gord knows a lot more about Ruskin, for example, than I do, and we have different takes on Ruskin and the arts and crafts movement in general, and so I think that there's a lot more to be said in there, but still, it's time for us to move on, and so although we're definitely going to be talking about that here today, certainly in the first part of this, part A here, there's a little bit of a gap, and I'd encourage you, first of all, to look out for any material that becomes available subsequently, but also to begin thinking about where you see the gap between where Gord left us and where I'm picking up right now, and thinking about filling that in. Not to spoil anything, but you will be filling that in through the next number of years at Sheridan once you get back in the studio. What is missing between where Gord left off and where I'm picking up is a huge part of everything that you will learn, whatever program you're in. But it's a huge part of what really underlines the core values of this program here at Sheridan. So what I want to do is I want to move on here and talk in terms of the wake, treating the materials that come after the Industrial Revolution as very much being seen as in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And we'll start really thinking in terms of a response to the Industrial Revolution. And I really wanted to directly pick up where Gord left off. So Gord, this isn't quite where he left. This was something Gord was talking about. This quote from William Morris is a very famous quote. It's here used in the Craft Ontario outside their front door. And it's a very important quote. It sums up a great deal. And of course, you can have a lot of fun with the language, and one of the things that Gord wanted to point out was this word or, know to be useful, or believe to be beautiful, and how important this word or is for Gord. And interestingly, as we went around, as we sort of discussed this slightly in class, we could see why the or would be very useful. But today's lecture, this lecture here, part A and part B, will both pick up on two different parts of this quote that I find very interesting. I find a lot about this quote very interesting, but I'm going to take part A of the lecture, as I suggested by the title, part A, the house here, as part, and then a part B that focuses on a different part of this quote. So really what I want to highlight is exactly that. This is the quote, "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." And before I move forward, I do think we should also point out, although I'm not going to talk about it, you should maybe think about this later, the difference in the verbs, basically. You do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. Knowing and believing are two hugely, fundamentally, crucially different ways of thinking about things. And the fact that for Morris, the verbs used associated with the ideas to know to be useful and believe to be beautiful, there's a huge amount of philosophical content, I guess, basically, in the selection of words. Now, I'm not going to talk about that necessarily, at least not directly, and not in this part A at least. But I do want you to think about it. What is the difference between knowing something and believing something? And is it relevant? And what about it is relevant? What is interesting about it in this quote, that you would know about usefulness, but you would believe about beauty? Anyway, I'll leave that for now, because what I want to focus on is this word. This is part A of this week's lecture, is about the house. For Gord, the word was or, and I agree, it's very important that you something, whether it's useful or beautiful, or useful and or beautiful, we talked about that in class, but for me is this relevance of the word house. And this is particularly symbolic of the time. I talked a little bit about Queen Victoria and the importance she has historically. Whether you're talking about the idea of what studio craft is, and we'll talk more about that in upcoming lectures, I think in next week. If you want to talk about what design as a concept is, especially design as a concept that has its roots in the Great Exhibition, or you want to talk about society more generally, certainly English-speaking Western world, basically specifically Canadian society, Queen Victoria's presence is vital, meaning it has a huge impact. I have this slide that obviously has a Christmas theme. It doesn't maybe feel particularly appropriate right now, but all of these things are Victorian ideas. Christmas trees, big family feasts, kind of excuse to overindulge and for it to look in a certain way. The fact that traditionally, at least, Christmas images have this red tone. This is a Victorian creation. Um, there are so many other things that we live with, the way that we use manners, for example, etiquette, social etiquette. I mean, you want to talk about social etiquette in a time of social distancing. Although we're quite a long way from Queen Victoria when we're dealing with that, remind me to tell you sometime about how social distancing worked in the Victorian age, and its giveaway is it's very similar to the way we're thinking about social distancing right now. Christmas cards too. My point here is that Queen Victoria had this huge impact, and what the impact was on domestic interiors. Uh, and the conception of the domestic. And that's why I really want to draw out this word house here. Look at these images I have here. This one is a pre-Raphaelite painter that's showing a Victorian interior. These are historic house museums showing what Victorian interiors looked like. Here's a photograph of an actual real Victorian interior. Sorry that that's a bit grainy there, but you get the idea. All these little trinkets and things on stands and little pictures of sickly children and draperies over everything and doilies on everything. Um, it's ridiculous to our eye, and maybe it's not. Maybe you think that this is awesome, and we'll come to talk about what taste is in the context of that probably later. But the point that I want to make here is that when we're talking about Victorian style, we're talking about domestic spaces primarily. Um, when we're talking about it in this kind of historic perspective, that's not to say that Victorian buildings weren't built. Of course they were. There were large buildings built during a Victorian era, during this kind of era of the wake of the Industrial Revolution. But even if we're talking about the Great Exhibition, remember the Great Exhibition was supposed to be about industry. Was supposed to be about how big can British design be? How significant and sort of massive can human innovation and this kind of use of British design in this innovative sense be? And yet so many of the exhibited artifacts and objects there, and so much of the way we talk about it historically, if you pick up a material cultures book, anthropological, sociological, even philosophical texts written today or any time between the exhibition and today, so much of it is talking in terms of objects that fit into the house, domestic interiors. This is one object. I pull this out because I forgot to mention it when I was talking about the Great Exhibition in the last lecture. This is a sideboard that was exhibited by a British company called the Gutta Percha Company. This was actually it was a multinational company, an early version of one, and at the time they were laying a telegraph cable. They were preparing to lay a telegraph cable between Europe and North America, between Britain and North America, and of course, this cable just lay on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. And what you need if you're going to lay a big semi-electrical cable along the bottom of the ocean is a material that coats that electrical cable. And sure enough, they had rubber. This rubber that was, of course, being extracted from I think Brazilian rainforests, but from rainforests somewhere and being used as a great material. It's still used today. Gutta percha is a kind of rubber that is still used extensively today. But in order to make an exhibition object for the Great Exhibition, they had it press molded into a sideboard. So this picture of this sideboard you see here in this sort of ridiculous over-the-top floral Victorian style, it was actually exhibited made out of rubber. It's not wood. It's not carved plaster or anything like that. It's rubber. And this is sort of a ridiculous object and one that I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention in the last lecture. But it's a domestic object, and so it serves my purpose here far more to the point that in this era what we're looking at is a shift to the domestic. Now think about all the other things we talked about up to this point, all of that stuff in the first half of the course up to the midterm, right? We're shifting to the domestic from. Here's the Roman aqueduct that I showed you from thousands, 2,000 years old at this point, influencing later subsequent buildings like the cathedral, the Romanesque cathedral here, a different Romanesque space, an abbey here with its portal, then the Gothic buildings that I showed you, even when we get into the Renaissance, even with humanism, even where the scale is coming down and we're talking about human beings, we're still talking about impressive, monumental subject matter. Even when the subject is discrete and small, like the Dura Great Turf here, um, the the point is that it's trying to be universal in some sense. It's trying to grapple with the subject and uh, dominated is not quite right. Own it may be slightly more appropriate. But what it is that it's universal. It's got this absolute quality to it. So again, where humanism and Leonardo's drawing of the Vitruvian Man here is meant to be human. It's meant to be sort of almost private, but certainly personal in some sense. It's still monumental. It's still trying to situate the human in relationship to geometric forms, trying to situate the human in a story that is as big as possible. The biggest, most universal story that anyone could conceive of at the time was algebra, something that would be true at any point in the universe, at any time in the history of the universe, and how do human beings fit into that. David's Donatello, again, Donatello's David. Even here, even where you've got, especially if you compare Donatello's to Michelangelo's David, where the figure is smaller, it's kind of more discreet, it's more human. The figure is still appealing to this, in this case, a biblical story, something that is much bigger, something is monumental, that has this same kind of scale, say, as the cathedrals or the aqueduct. Even here, here's a genre painting, the Arnolfini portrait, and yet even here, where it is two kind of fairly random people, here, let's make it bigger. Why should we care about them? Well, actually, we really don't. They're just rich people showing us that they're rich. Even they come to have a historic relevance. Now, this is an interesting part of what I'm talking about here. What becomes historically important is maybe different from what is important at the time. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, even here, where they're showing us a domestic interior, it's still got this monumentality to it. What they're doing is they're trying to make their domestic setting eternal, at least somehow universally important, and that's even where we get this idea of genre painting. The very fact that we create a name for this style of painting suggests that there is something monumental being constructed here. We're turning the everyday into a monument, and that's what's going on here. And of course, everything about the painting is meant to suggest this kind of monumentality. So the point that I'm making here is that we've been talking about monumental things. We've been talking about things that are basically anything but domestic, anything but the actual lived life of real people. This, perhaps, the Arnolfini portrait here, is perhaps the closest we get to it. Certainly some of the other objects we looked at, even things that sort of have a domestic feel to them, a bed, for example, here, or an armoire, they're not domestic. They're not actually really domestic. These belong in palaces. These belong in history, now in museums. And in fact, I didn't crop this part out here. You can see here that this is where this object is on display. You can see the museum lighting showing it far out of its domestic context, because it's not a domestic object. This isn't actually really a domestic object at all. And I put Dura in here to kind of emphasize that. What we're looking at up to the Industrial Revolution, up to the period that we're just reaching now, is there's either things that don't really count, or there's monumentally important things, and here sort of represented in some loose way by this juxtaposition here. Here's the Andrews, the Gainsborough picture of the Andrews couple, showing their wealth, showing their power. They're pretty average people. Sure, they're rich, they're gentry, whatever. The point is that they're pretty normal people in an aristocratic sense. And this is their property. So you could call this sort of a kind of a domestic setting, but of course it's not. Everything about it is massive. And the very fact that Gainsborough has been hired and probably paid very well to represent this shows that there's nothing really domestic about this at all. This isn't everyday life. Even for these people who are probably used to being treated like special people, this is a special occasion. And of course, this object then becomes historic because of it. The other people, so the other side of this, we have very little on them up to this point. Now, as I alluded to a moment ago, that's partly because of the way history is written. History, especially a class like this, where it's objects in history, the things that survive are the things that we talk about, and the things that survive are usually the posh, expensive ones that are commissioned from great artists, and that whole story, that modernist story of the great artist, is just a part of that problem. So we don't have a lot of kind of everyday objects that are not particularly old, meaning only a few hundred years old, 400 or 500 years old. Everything that we have that we talk about ends up kind of being historic, and this is one of the issues with modernism that we'll be getting to in the next couple of weeks, meaning in next week. So up to the Industrial Revolution, through this era of cottage industry, the only things that we're really focusing on, and this is both historic and in our contemporary view of the creation of the history, is these kind of monumental, what I keep referring to as monumental objects. And beginning with the Reformation, but only very slightly, there is a shift to individualism in a way that we would call, well, what I'm calling domestic, where individual private life becomes something that is worth thinking about. Really, that's what it is. It's not that it becomes important, it's that it becomes something that there is a capacity to think about. And what this is often talked about is a rise of the middle class. That up to this point, up to the Industrial Revolution, you had very wealthy people and then everybody else. And very wealthy people could afford to hire the artists and could afford to make the commissions and the patronage that supported their sort of view. And before that, you had the church basically in that place building the massive cathedrals and even then the smaller cathedrals. So there wasn't really any need, there wasn't any interest, there wasn't any room for that. No one was buying. There was no group of people whom you could call represented, who you could see as represented in material culture from a middle class, because there was no middle class. With the creation of a middle class, with this development through the Industrial Revolution, suddenly domestic settings become important. And I've got Wedgwood represented here because of, and we're not going to go back through the whole story here of the Wedgwood story, but you have this interest in objects that normal people can buy, but more importantly, objects that are not monumental. These examples, the one, the plate that was sent to Catherine the Great, or the first success that Wedgwood had in creating the ceramic porcelain vase, those have some history to them. Those get put in museums and they're really important. But it's all the other stuff. It's the lesser expensive versions, most of which will now have been smashed and long since vanished, that come into existence where there had been nothing like that in existence. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that there's a shift towards the domestic. And this is why I wanted to highlight that word from the quote that Gord introduced us to, the William Morris quote: "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." No one would have thought to say it like that 50 years, certainly 100 years, 200 years before. Have nothing in your house that you have any thoughts about, because no one will be thinking in terms of a house in that way. So what I want to do is pick up the arts and crafts movement where Gord was talking about, but really emphasize this new development, this development of domestic sensibility. Now, I'm not just talking about things that get made for houses, as in interior decoration, basically. I'm thinking of the domestic in an almost slightly abstract sense, but in this broader sense of things that are not monumental, things that are not really meant to be historically important, things that are for private consumption, have a utility perhaps, but also perhaps have a beauty. That's a big part of what I'm also talking about here today. Um, and but on a scale that is private, that is individual and not monumental, not meant to be historic. So to kind of pick up, I want to, just before we move on, these are Gord's, these are the values that Gord articulated from the arts and crafts movement. And I want to sneak two others in here, which I don't think Gord would have too much of a problem with. He definitely talked about the medieval, the actual Gothic revival, and also the sort of mythic Gothic of the myths, say from the medieval period that the arts and crafts movement brought in to their work. Not so interested in that here, but I will be interested in the idea of patterns inspired by local plants and animals, and that's a big part of what vernacular means. We talked a little bit about what vernacular means, and it's this. I wanted to include this use of the word local, local plants and animals, and that's very important. And we'll come back to why that's so important. But I want to put all of these up, Gord's original and then my two added one, and have you think about them in terms of this idea of the house. Have nothing in your house that you do not know and believe. Because this is what it's all about for Morris, starting with Morris, and for all subsequent questions of design. Now, I know that's a controversial statement. I think that there's plenty of great design that is designed that is historic, that we will see in museums 100 years, 200 years from now. But I also think that the function of good design is not necessarily to do that, to end up in a museum. The first function of good design is to be useful to people and perhaps beautiful for people. I'm definitely not separating those two at this point. But on this, again, I'll use the word on this domestic level. Meaning for private personal use, where questions of the monumental, of the historic, really don't enter into the original design purpose. Even something that seems a sort of iconic to us as maybe an Apple product or the iPhone, the iPad or something, or any of the Brown products or whatever. We'll talk about some examples of some great industrial design later. They may be historic, they may be very beautiful, they may be very useful, they may be fantastic, but they're domestic, they're not monumental. And I know you can make an argument that a Brown, the alarm clock, it has this monumentality to it, but that's not its underlying function. Its underlying purpose in the world is not to be monumental, it is to be domestic. And to sort of overemphasize this fairly basic but super crucial point, this is a new development in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. This interest in the house, at the domestic level. So here's Red House that Morris and one of his colleagues, Philip Webb, designed. Morris lived here for a little while with his family. He and Webb designed objects specifically for this house. Most importantly, it was built and designed as a focus for the arts and crafts movement. Well, it wasn't called the arts and crafts movement exactly at that point, but it was a center for Morris's work. And the idea was people would come and visit, and it was to function as a sort of a center of gravity for what Morris hoped would be a shift in the way that manufacturing and creation and the making of things happened, and the way design happened. And so it's no coincidence that it's a house. It's not an institute. It's not a college. It's not a monument. It's not some kind of cathedral, whatever, some kind of Crystal Palace style thing. It's a house. And again, he just to be clear, he didn't intend to just throw his doors open to anyone who happened to wander by and wanted to talk about interesting vernacular inspiration and honest workmanship. You had to kind of be part of his close circle to be invited there, but it was symbolically the center of this movement. And so my point is, it's important that it's a house that is symbolically the center. Here's an object, a goblet that he and Webb designed specifically as part of the Red House, of decorating and filling the Red House. This is historic. We'll find this in a museum. That my point is not that this doesn't have a place in a museum or that it's not historic. My point is that it wasn't designed to be monumental. It was designed to be beautiful. It was designed to be useful. It was designed as part of what we'll call collect under the umbrella of the arts and crafts movement, and that is as a domestic object. And everything we look through, and I'm going to just move through a few of these quite quickly here because I'm kind of talking too much. Everything that Morris and company and Morris himself thought of in these terms, in what I'm calling domestic terms, that it has something to do with the house, as in the space people actually live in, not something symbolic, not something that is meant to ride over the top of the rest of society in some way, but to be domestic, to be personally useful. The Strawberry Thief. This is probably one of Morris's most famous patterns, used in all sorts of applications. This is in its upholstery form. It also appears as wallpaper. I think it appears as a rug floor treatment at some point, and in other places too. You should certainly know the Strawberry Thief. It's a good pattern to know. It's a domestic object. It's everything I just mentioned there: furnishings, wall treatments, floor treatments. All of those are for domestic settings. You can go into an upholstery store today and buy Strawberry Thief and get your chairs done in it and probably get the wallpaper to match. That might be a bit too much. Don't do that. But you could do that because it still exists, because it is domestic, because it is real. And where did Morris get the inspiration from? He was out at his other house, later house, Kelmscott House, and he was sitting in the garden and he watched the birds flying into the garden and stealing the strawberries from the plants that were growing in the garden. And then he made this design himself, right? I can't think of anything more domestic. He didn't go out and have an epiphany. He didn't tap into his ingenio and communicate with the powers of the universe. He just went out and looked what was happening in his garden. So this idea of the domestic is at every stage, at every level here. So when we're talking about the subject of the wake of the Industrial Revolution, there's a whole lot of different ways to think about it, and this is just one of the ways to think about it. This newfound relevance of the house, or as I'm calling it, the domestic. The final point that I want to make on the William Morris front is this. I couldn't find any images of what I'm actually about to talk to, so this is the closest I can show you, and it's not too far off. Mary Morris and May Morris, the people around Morris were very caught up in his ideas, and so his daughter had this great idea of making some of the designs accessible to as many people as possible. So one of the things that she, I guess, spearheaded, we might say, she had the idea and then she actually made it happen, was to print samplers like this on the side of bags that delivered goods to houses. So in this era, in the end of the 19th century, houses, even fairly average middle-class houses, would have probably at least one servant and usually several more, at least 3 or 4, and the big houses, of course, many more than that. These houses, it wasn't the way we have it today, where you go to the supermarket every couple of days or whatever. I mean, we don't do that anymore because we're all locked in our houses. But in the old days, when we used to go to the supermarket every couple of days, you'd stock up, and that's how you live your life. In this day, you'd have most of your things delivered. End of the 19th century, you're having stuff delivered to your house. Things like coal, things like flour, sugar, coffee would come in bags of various sizes, usually of some kind of canvas material. It was May Morris's idea to have printed on these bags patterns that the housemaids would be able to cut out and then embroider. They'd embroider on the pattern, and assuming that it was clean and whatever, they could make them into pillowcases for themselves, or they could just make them for fun, frame them on the wall. Now that may not sound like fun to you, and how much fun it really was for them. This was an era where there's no TV. They probably aren't reading too many books, perhaps. This is an idea of fun, doing a bit of embroidery for someone. The history of why it would be the maids that would be doing that is fascinating, and I encourage you to read a book by Rosika Parker called The Subversive Stitch if you want to know about the history of embroidery in feminism, or rather, history of feminism in embroidery. Anyway, that's a whole other subject. Printing these patterns on the sides of bags gave access to very sophisticated patterns, full-on Philip Webb or William Morris patterns that were then accessible to people who couldn't afford this stuff. They can't afford to go out and buy Strawberry Thief wallpaper or upholstery. This is all part of Morris's kind of socialist activism, but it's part of this move towards this concept of the domestic, something that reaches to everyone, something that is aware that everyone has a domestic, a private life that needs some kind of softening, that needs some kind of beauty or function in it. So what you're seeing here is, 100 years before, no matter how generous or how socialist you want to call it that, someone might have been, they would never have thought of creating artistic designs that would in some way benefit the servant class. Morris is thinking that, and his daughter is thinking that because of their politics, because of their socialism. But it's also their awareness of the fact that there even is such a thing as a private life for people, a house, a way of thinking about the house, a domestic setting. This is the point that I'm trying to make, that the domestic becomes a thing in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Keep that in mind as we move into different variations of this. Art Nouveau is the French version of arts and crafts. Now, that's not entirely true. That's a real smudging of it, and if you're an Art Nouveau fan, I would encourage you to look more deeply into it than the way I'm presenting it right here. But I hope you can see that although this is totally different from the Strawberry Thief, it's actually very similar to the Strawberry Thief. When you look at the values that Gore presented to us, especially when we talk about vernacular inspiration, and as I put it, patterns inspired by local plants and animals, you have exactly the same thing. But where, can I go back to it very easily? No, not very easily, but I'll do it anyway. So what you have here is local plants and animals. This is what the plants in England look like. They are strawberry plants in this instance, but they have a tendency to be smaller. The flowers are a little bit smaller, English plants, because it rains a lot, so you get good plants, but it's not really that warm, so the plants tend to be a little bit coarser. The flowers tend to be a little bit smaller. Go have a look at a botany book and you'll see what I mean. In France and Belgium, where this was sourced, especially in southern France, especially in southern parts of the continent, and the communication between Spain and Italy and France and Belgium is very important in this era. The flowers are much bigger. The plants are much juicier. So Art Nouveau, to my mind, and this is not at all incorrect, is doing very much the same kind of thing that arts and crafts is doing in Britain, but on the continent here in Belgium and France, it looks different to us, but that's only because their local inspiration is much fleshier, it's much juicier, because that's what the plants look like. It's warmer, they have a different climate, the plants end up looking much more like these plants. So you get this, I show you this, you may be familiar with this one. This is one of another one of the Czech artist Musha's arts posters, advertisements. Same kind of thing. This is very Art Nouveau, and here you see it's nature. It's a celebration of these kind of materials, this kind of fleshiness. This is an interior. This is a jewelry shop, if I remember correctly. Yes, it is. This is Fouquet's jewelry shop. They've restored it to its original. I hope you see how similar to arts and crafts Art Nouveau is, and really, although you could break it apart a lot more than this, in very broad strokes, the only difference between Art Nouveau and arts and crafts is just where they're drawing their inspiration from. They're treating it exactly the same way. They're looking at thoughtful handwork. I'm going back to Gould's words here. Thoughtful handwork, truth to materials, right? Like the wood is very clearly wood. It's very exposed wood. It looks fantastic. The metal work, when they're using bronze, when they're using copper, they're wanting the patina of the copper to really be present. That's why you see that kind of greened effect on copper when it's used in Art Nouveau, because they want to show that the material is kind of honestly aging in the way it kind of naturally is inclined to do. And again, to make the point, they're using the same kind of inspiration from the plant life they see around them, from the animal life they see around them, but on the continent of Europe, you have a slightly different plant life because the climate is different, so things look slightly different, but otherwise it's very similar. Same kind of attention to detail, same kind of quality workmanship. Again, I'm just looking at Gord's words here, the ornament and the kind of the obvious joy in labor. So this is Art Nouveau, and I have to in a art and design history course, you've got to talk about these movements, which are sometimes sort of brushed over a little bit, certainly in the art history textbooks. And want to know why? Because it's domestic. This is stuff that has a domestic feel. And again, let me emphasize, domestic doesn't just mean things that fit in the house. I would include the Fouquet, the jewelry store there as kind of a domestic setting. It's not meant to be monumental. It's not meant to be historic necessarily. It's meant to have this a context of private use. Here's an amazing arts and crafts object. I mean, I'm not even going to start trying to pull apart how this works as an object, but it is. It's incredible. It's absolutely beautiful. Here's a bed that also has this. I'm not a big fan of moths, so I find this a little bit creepy. But like, look at this. Look at this headboard in the context of William Morris and him painting the medieval myths on the furniture, especially in that early work that Gord showed us. There it is, that sort of thing again. So Art Nouveau, it has a different aesthetic. It looks different. It feels different. Even the objects themselves are different. A belt buckle. I can't think of any arts and crafts belt buckle. That's because belts English fashion wouldn't have adopted this kind of clothing fashion, wouldn't have adopted this kind of object necessarily. But the idea is, to my mind, very, very comparable. And when you look at these objects, you can I hope see what I mean. And again, just to emphasize my point, here we are, Art Nouveau, very, this is iconic French, Parisian, still in use and being restored and used today. And this is Art Nouveau, this is kind of part of the myth of Paris, drawing on these same kind of things, the workmanship, the joy in labor, the vernacular and local source of inspiration. And it's also domestic. Again, not so much about have anything in your house, but if you can extend that idea, just the house, the notion of the house, what we mean by have nothing in your house you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. I think that this the metro station entrance here definitely falls into that, as does the Galerie Lafayette. This is historic. If you're interested in the history of shopping, Galerie Lafayette probably figures on the front cover and is the first chapter. It's a big shopping center, department store in Paris. It's still in operation, and was a huge part of a major cultural shift. I can't even begin to get into it. It's a big story. Émile Zola made basically a career writing novels about the entire kind of social fabric around a place like Galerie Lafayette. Here you have Art Nouveau in an architectural stage. So this is sort of the most monumental kind of object I can find in this Art Nouveau style. But even here, what is it doing? It's for a department store. It's not a cathedral. It's not even a university, or it's not even a great exhibition space in that sense. It's a shop where people went to buy stuff for their personal, private, non-monumental use. So although the building itself definitely has something of a monumentality to it, I would still argue that it has a domestic function. And again, sort of to come back to the point of this half of the lecture, this is what uh, this is the point I want to emphasize. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, all of this stuff starts existing. None of this stuff existed before. And it's not just none of the stuff existed, the very context, the very concept, the possibility for spaces like this and objects like this just didn't exist. Can't talk about Art Nouveau without also talking about Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the Glaswegian. So this is back in Britain, but now we're in Scotland. Rennie Mackintosh, quite different from arts and crafts, but very connected. And when we get into Frank Lloyd Wright and architecture in a little while, we'll be drawing on the same kind of waters that Rennie Mackintosh was producing, was drawing on, the inspirations that Rennie Mackintosh was drawing on, and then producing these kinds of objects. I don't need to say it, right? These are domestic objects. These are wardrobes. And even when the design, Rennie Mackintosh's design, gets put in a more public space, here we've got a tea room in Glasgow. In Glasgow, I think, yes, in Glasgow. You've got it's still a domestic setting. It still is domestic. Keep in mind, these designs are 100 years old, more than 100 years old, and yeah, crikey, more like 150 years old. And look how like trippy space age they look. Now that's partly because of the way this photograph is taken, but the point I'm also making here is that we're at the beginning of the design period that we're currently in when we're looking at Rennie Mackintosh, and Rennie Mackintosh is bridging us in a way, connecting, drawing on these same inspirations that Art Nouveau and the arts and crafts movement were drawing on, all of these terms that Gord was using, and taking it in the kind of the next step forward, and we'll be getting into that in the next half of the lecture. So, to sort of sum up in a way, here's a William Morris rug on the left, and here's a Celtic cross, a historic 1,000-year-old Celtic cross on the other side. Rennie Mackintosh is drawing on both of these ideas, and both of them are communicating with nature and vernacular objects and workmanship in a fascinating way. Morris is aware of it, Rennie Mackintosh is aware of it. Everything we just looked at from Art Nouveau on the continent is aware of it. And it's a response. It's a response to the Industrial Revolution. It's a response to standardization, to mass production, to what is seen to be as a dehumanizing force. So what I've got here, and I'll be using this slide again. These are historic. This is a weaving. These are looms that work in sort of 19th century, much more the context of the Industrial Revolution as it first started happening. This is a like third wave or whatever you'd call it of the Industrial Revolution. This is a Ford plant, but it's basically, this is Wedgwood gone big, right? Wedgwood did the division of labor, or perfected, improved the division of labor, used it certainly to his benefit, knew all about marketing. Henry Ford then kind of added a zero, and created Fordism, and the way he produced his Model T is fascinating. And then we have sort of more contemporary situations. Here, one of Ed Batinsky's photographs showing factory work, contemporary factory work, outputs of contemporary factory work, these kind of anonymous mass production of cars, and of course Coca-Cola has been a great backdrop to all of that. So this is the industrial that begins to be responded to immediately in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. As soon as the Industrial Revolution starts happening in the 1750s, people are responding to it. And certainly, as we see Morris and others come through, we're seeing other responses. And what we're of course talking about is the responses that continue. Art Deco is sort of this American version of Art Nouveau. Responds in a slightly different way, slightly less naturalistic, slightly more mechanical, and that's why I want to introduce it now at the end of this half of the video. And of course we'll get to Bauhaus, which is in the same kind of way as Art Deco, drawing on the industrial, kind of trusting in the industrial rather than rejecting it and going to nature, but also quite different in its inspirations. So this is the end of part A. Have a break, stretch your legs, don't go outside. No, go outside, have a breath of fresh air. Go buy some toilet paper or something. And then, oh wait, no, we can't do that anymore. Come back, part B starts in a few minutes.